I used to believe silence was a form of peace, that if no one was shouting, if no doors were slamming, if no one was accusing anyone of old wounds, then maybe we were fine. Maybe distance was maturity, maybe avoidance was wisdom. That is what I told myself for 12 long years, 12 birthdays missed, 12 Thanksgivings where I cooked too much food and packed half of it into containers no one came to claim. 12 Christmas mornings where I wrapped gifts for people who mailed theirs instead. Silence is not peace. Silence is a slow leak. You do not hear it at first. You only notice one day that the house feels too big, that the walls echo differently, that your name is no longer spoken in the tone it once was. It started with something small. It always does. My daughter Renee said I had embarrassed her at a dinner party. I had told a story about when she was little and scared of thunderstorms, how she used to crawl into my bed and pretend she was only checking if I was still breathing. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. She did not. On the drive home, she said I never respected her boundaries. I remember gripping the steering wheel and saying, "Baby, it was just a memory." She replied, "It was my memory." That sentence hung between us like a cracked mirror. I did not know then that it would be the last car ride we would take alone together. Weeks passed, then months. Our phone calls became shorter, sharper. She accused, I defended. I reminded her of sacrifices. She reminded me of control. Every conversation ended with one of us saying, "You just don't understand." Eventually, we stopped trying. Silence settled in like dust, not dramatic, not explosive, just steady and suffocating. My son, Marcus, chose sides without ever saying he did. He would call me, but never when Renee was around. "I don't want to be in the middle," he would say. The middle, as if I had declared war, as if motherhood had become a battlefield and I had somehow enlisted without knowing. When he married, I found out through a photo someone else posted. I sent a gift. No reply. I told myself they were busy building their lives. I told myself children are meant to leave. I told myself a lot of things that made loneliness sound noble, but loneliness is not noble. It is humiliating. It is standing in the grocery store aisle staring at 2 cans of soup and wondering why you are cooking for 4. It is sitting in church pretending you prefer the back pew because it is quieter. It is rehearsing conversations in your head that never happen. For years, I held on to anger like it was proof that I had been wronged. If I was angry, then I mattered. If I was hurt, then something precious had been taken. But anger is heavy. It ages you faster than time. I began to notice the lines around my mouth deepening, not from laughter, but from restraint. I stopped telling stories because I did not know who would accuse me of rewriting them. Then one Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. I almost did not answer because I no longer recognized the number. Silence teaches you not to expect good news. When I picked up, I heard breathing, not words, just breathing. And then softly, "Mum." I did not recognize her voice at first. It sounded older, careful, like someone stepping onto thin ice. My heart betrayed me immediately. It leaped before my pride could stop it. "Renee," I said, and my own voice cracked in a way I hated. There was a pause, long enough for both of us to consider hanging up. Then she said, "Dad's anniversary is next month." I closed my eyes. Her father had been the glue once, the referee, the translator between my intensity and her independence. He had been gone 15 years, and somehow his absence still managed to rearrange the room. "I know," I said. "I was thinking," she continued, "maybe we could all have dinner, together. Just once. For him, just once." The words landed heavier than any accusation she had ever thrown at me. This was not an apology. It was not reconciliation. It was a temporary truce in honor of a man who no longer sat at the head of the table. My instinct was to protect myself, to say I was busy, to ask why now, to demand something that sounded like remorse. Instead, I surprised myself. "What day?" I asked. She exhaled. I heard relief she tried to hide. "Sunday. I can host, in her house, at her table." The shift in power was subtle but undeniable. For years, I had presided over holidays. I had carved the turkey, poured the tea, corrected the posture, filled the silence. Now I would be the guest, a visitor in the life I once managed. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The clock ticked louder than usual. I realized I was afraid. Not of yelling, not of confrontation. I was afraid of seeing who we had become without each other. When you do not speak for years, you create versions of one another in your mind. In mine, Renee had become ungrateful, cold, dismissive. In hers, I am sure I had become overbearing, manipulative, impossible. We had turned into caricatures to justify the distance. What if reality was more complicated? What if neither of us were villains? What if we had both simply been stubborn and scared? I walked into the living room and looked at the old dining table I still kept, though it seated 6 and I lived alone. I ran my hand across the wood, worn smooth by decades of elbows and spilled milk, and whispered apologies. I thought about all the meals eaten there, the arguments resolved before dessert, the nights we lingered because no one wanted to admit the day was over. After years of silence, we were going to sit at one table again, not mine, hers. And I did not know if that frightened me more than the quiet ever had. The weeks leading up to that Sunday stretched longer than the 12 years that had come before it. I found myself rehearsing simple greetings in the mirror. "Hello, sweetheart. You look well. It's good to see you." Each sentence sounded either too eager or too cold. I did not know how to be natural with my own child anymore. That realization settled in my chest like a stone. I told almost no one about the dinner. Pride has a strange way of disguising fear. If I announced it and something went wrong, I would have to relive the embarrassment in front of witnesses. So I carried the news quietly, like fragile glass. On Thursday, Marcus called. That alone told me Renee had informed him. He rarely phoned without a reason. "You going Sunday?" he asked, skipping any softness. "Yes," I said. "Are you?" A pause. "Yeah. Figured it's time." Time for what? I wanted to ask. Time to forgive? Time to pretend? Time to measure how much damage had calcified? But I did not push. For years, I had pushed. That had been part of the problem. Every silence I had tried to fill, every distance I had tried to close, control they called it. I had called it care. "She's nervous," Marcus added. The confession startled me. "About what?" "About you walking out." I almost laughed. Of all the accusations that had circled me over the years, walking away had never been one of them. "I've never walked away from my children," I said quietly. "I know," he replied, softer now, "but she thinks you might." After we hung up, I sat with that sentence. She thinks you might. Had I become unpredictable in her memory? Had my hurt twisted into something sharp enough that she expected retaliation? Silence does that. It fills in blanks with worst-case scenarios. On Saturday, I ironed a blouse I had not worn in years. Pale blue, simple. I did not want to appear as though I were dressing for battle. I wanted to look like myself, but perhaps a gentler version. I left my heavier jewelry in the drawer, no armor. Sunday arrived cold and bright. I drove slower than usual, aware of every red light, every turn. Renee lived only 20 minutes away, but the journey felt ceremonial, like crossing into foreign territory. Her neighborhood was newer than mine, wider sidewalks, younger trees, houses that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and ambition. When I pulled into her driveway, my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I sat there a moment longer than necessary, watching the curtains shift. She was waiting. Of course she was. You do not invite your estranged mother to dinner and then forget the time. I stepped out, smoothing my blouse. The front door opened before I reached it. Renee stood there, thinner than I remembered, hair pulled back in a low bun. For a split second, I saw the little girl who used to hide behind my legs at parent-teacher conferences. Then the woman returned. "Hi, Mom," she said. "Hi, Renee." We did not hug immediately. We stood measuring the space between us. Finally, she stepped forward, and our arms wrapped around each other in a way that was both familiar and cautious. She smelled like the same lavender soap she used in high school. Memory is cruel like that. It makes you believe nothing has changed. "Come in," she said, pulling back. Her house was warm. The dining table was already set. 4 plates, 4 glasses, a centerpiece of white lilies. My breath caught at the sight. She had always hated lilies when she was younger, said they smelled like funerals. I wondered if she had chosen them for her father. Marcus was in the kitchen pretending to be busy with the oven. When he saw me, he froze for a heartbeat before offering a half smile. "Hey, Ma." Marcus. I touched his arm, a brief acknowledgement of years spent skirting conflict. He squeezed my hand once, as if to say we would get through this. We moved around each other awkwardly at first. Renee poured water. I offered to help. She declined. Marcus made a joke about overcooking the chicken. The air was tight, but not hostile. It felt like the first minutes of a long flight, everyone buckled in, uncertain of turbulence. When we finally sat down, something inside me shifted. The table was rectangular, not round like mine. I sat at one end by accident, instinctively taking the position I had always held. Renee hesitated before sitting opposite me. Marcus chose the side between us as though still occupying the middle. For a moment, no one spoke. The clink of silverware sounded louder than it should have. I noticed Renee's hands trembling slightly as she reached for the bread basket. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the pressure, but I did not trust myself to choose the right words. Instead, Marcus cleared his throat. "Dad would have liked this," he said. The mention of their father loosened something in the room. We began sharing small memories at first. The way he insisted on carving meat even when he had a fever. His terrible singing voice during road trips. Renee laughed unexpectedly, a full, unguarded sound that startled us all. As the meal continued, conversation grew less forced. We discussed work, neighbors, the price of groceries, surface topics, safe ground. But beneath every exchange was the unspoken history pressing against us like a storm waiting offshore. Halfway through dessert, Renee set her fork down. The shift in her posture told me what was coming before she spoke. "I don't want to pretend," she said, eyes fixed on the table. "Not tonight." Marcus inhaled sharply. I felt my spine straighten. Here it was, the reckoning. "I know we're here for Dad," she continued, "but we can't sit at this table like nothing happened." Silence fell again, heavier this time. My instinct was to defend, to explain, to list every sacrifice like receipts laid out for inspection. But something inside me whispered, "If you do that, you will lose her again." So I did something I had not done in 12 years. I waited, and in that waiting I felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. For years I had rushed to fill silence before it could accuse me of being wrong. I had always believed that the first person to speak controlled the direction of the conversation, and control had been my comfort for most of my life. But as Renee sat across from me, her fingers pressed tightly against the edge of her plate, I understood that if I interrupted now, if I corrected her tone or reshaped her memory, we would return to the same battlefield we had occupied for over a decade. So I stayed still. I let her gather her thoughts without rescuing her from discomfort. The air felt heavy, but not hostile. It felt like the seconds before rain finally falls after months of dry heat. When she finally lifted her eyes to mine, I saw something I had not allowed myself to notice before. She was not angry in the way I had always imagined. She was tired. Tired of defending her adulthood. Tired of feeling measured against who she used to be. "I felt small around you," she said, her voice steady but fragile at the edges. The words did not explode. They landed quietly, but their weight spread across the table like spilled water. Marcus shifted slightly beside us, but he did not intervene. He had lived in the space between us long enough to know this was not his battle to referee. "I never wanted you to feel small," I answered carefully, forcing myself to keep my voice level. In the past, that sentence would have been followed by explanation, justification, a catalogue of intentions. This time I let it stand alone. Renee studied my face as if searching for signs that I was preparing to argue. When she did not find them, she continued. She told me that every correction, every retold story, every public reminder of her childhood felt like an invisible hand pressing her back into a version of herself she had outgrown. She said that when I laughed about old fears or habits, it felt like I was announcing that she would never fully become her own person in my eyes. As she spoke, memories surfaced uninvited. Dinner parties where I finished her sentences because I thought she was rambling. Holidays where I adjusted her recipes before tasting them. Conversations where I used the phrase, "after all I've done," as if love were an invoice waiting to be settled. I had believed I was protecting her from embarrassment, smoothing her path, ensuring she presented well to the world. I had not realized that in doing so, I was erasing the very independence I claimed to admire. The hardest part was recognizing that my intentions did not cancel out her experience. Both could exist at once. I could have loved her fiercely and still caused harm. Marcus finally spoke, his tone measured but sincere. "We didn't know you were scared after Dad died," he said, looking at me instead of Renee. That word again. Scared. I had wrapped my grief in competence, cooked larger meals, managed finances without complaint, offered advice even when none was requested. I thought strength would reassure them. I did not understand that strength without vulnerability can feel like distance. After their father passed, I had tightened my grip not because I wanted control, but because I feared becoming unnecessary. If they did not need my guidance, what role did I have left? I see now how that fear translated into overcorrection, into constant involvement disguised as devotion. Renee nodded slowly as Marcus spoke, and I realized this had not been a single misunderstanding. It had been a pattern, a rhythm we all participated in. She withdrew to protect her autonomy, I pushed to protect my relevance. Marcus balanced between us until the strain grew too great and silence felt easier than mediation. 12 years were not built from one argument. They were constructed from accumulated pride, from apologies rehearsed but never delivered, from phone calls nearly made and then abandoned. The lilies at the center of the table filled the room with their thick scent, and instead of reminding me of funerals, they reminded me of how often we mourn relationships while the people involved are still alive. I looked at my daughter, not as a child who had rejected me, but as a woman who had been trying to breathe in a space that felt too narrow. "I don't want us to go back to what we were," I said slowly, choosing each word with care. "But I don't want to lose what we could still be." My voice trembled despite my effort to steady it. Renee's eyes softened, and for the first time that evening, the tension in her shoulders eased. "I don't want the old version either," she replied. "I just want room to be who I am, without feeling corrected." There was no dramatic embrace, no immediate forgiveness sealing the moment. What we shared instead was something quieter and more durable: recognition. We were no longer defending our own versions of the past. We were acknowledging that both of us had been protecting wounds in ways that hurt the other. Marcus let out a slow breath, as if he had been holding it for years. And sitting there at that rectangular table that was not mine, I understood that reconciliation is not about winning the narrative, it is about surrendering the need to control it. For the first time in a long time, silence did not feel like distance. It felt like space being made for something new. The quiet that followed was different from the silence we had lived in for years. It was not avoidance, but processing, the careful rearranging of old assumptions into something that resembled truth. Renee leaned back in her chair, exhaling as if she had been holding that confession in her lungs for a decade, and I could see the vulnerability she had once hidden behind sharp words. Marcus reached for his glass and took a slow sip, his eyes moving between us, measuring the temperature of the room the way he always had when we were on the verge of conflict. I realized then how much weight he had carried, how often he had absorbed tension neither of us wanted to confront directly. "I should have said something sooner," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, but staying quiet didn't help either of you." His honesty settled over the table like a second layer of truth, and instead of feeling accused, I felt strangely grateful. It takes courage to admit complicity in a silence that once felt safer than confrontation. For so long, I had believed I was the only one wounded by those missing years. But sitting there, I could see that estrangement does not isolate itself neatly. It seeps into everyone connected to it. The space between us had not been empty. It had been crowded with unspoken explanations and imagined intentions. I looked at both of my children and felt something unexpected. Regret not for being imperfect, but for pretending I had to be perfect in order to be respected. Perfection had been my shield, and it had kept me from saying the simplest thing. I was afraid of losing you. Renee rested her elbows lightly on the table, her posture no longer defensive, but open in a way I had not seen since she was young. I didn't know how to come back without feeling like I had to apologize for growing up, she said quietly, and the sentence struck me with a clarity that made my chest tighten. I had framed her independence as rejection because I did not know how to separate her evolution from my own sense of usefulness. I remembered the first apartment she rented without asking for my opinion, the job she accepted in another city without seeking advice, the way I smiled publicly but criticized privately, disguising my fear as concern. At the time, I told myself I was guiding her. Now I could see how easily guidance can slide into control when it is fueled by insecurity. I thought if I admitted I needed space, you'd think I didn't love you, she continued, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass absent-mindedly. The vulnerability in her voice made me want to reach across the table and undo years of misunderstanding with a single gesture. But I understood now that reconciliation is not built on dramatic gestures. It is built on listening without interruption. I let her speak fully, resisting the urge to reassure her prematurely. She deserved to finish her thought without being edited by my comfort. The room felt steadier with each truth spoken aloud, as though the foundation beneath us was finally being repaired rather than painted over. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than tense. Maybe we all confused love with control in different ways, he said, and the observation hung in the air, balanced and fair. I had controlled through advice and correction, believing constant involvement equaled devotion. Renee had controlled through withdrawal, deciding distance was the only way to claim autonomy. Marcus had controlled by neutrality, maintaining peace by refusing to challenge either side directly. None of us had intended harm, yet harm had accumulated quietly in the absence of honest conversation. I felt an unexpected softness toward my children in that moment, not the softness of nostalgia, but the softness that comes from seeing complexity instead of blame. I don't want to relive every argument tonight, I said carefully, aware that excavation has limits, but I do want us to agree that we won't disappear from each other again without trying. The sentence felt both fragile and firm, like a boundary drawn with compassion rather than fear. Renee met my eyes and nodded slowly, and Marcus mirrored the gesture, a silent agreement forming without ceremony. It was not forgiveness in the cinematic sense, it was commitment to presence. After years of silence, that felt revolutionary. The table between us no longer seemed like a line dividing territory, it felt like shared ground. As plates were cleared and coffee poured, the conversation shifted gently toward the present, but the undercurrent of honesty remained. We spoke about work pressures, about aging, about the strange realization that time does not slow simply because we wish it would. Renee mentioned a recent setback at her job, something she had not told me before, and instead of offering immediate solutions, I asked her how it made her feel. The simplicity of that question surprised both of us. She answered thoughtfully, and I listened without rearranging her words into advice. Marcus shared that he often felt responsible for keeping everyone comfortable, and I told him he did not have to carry that role anymore. There was no grand reconciliation speech, no dramatic tears that washed everything clean, but there was a shift that felt authentic and earned. When I finally stood to leave, Renee walked me to the door, and this time when we hugged, the embrace lingered without calculation. "I'm glad you came," she whispered, and I understood that the courage had not been mine alone. Driving home, I realized that sitting at one table had not erased the past, but it had transformed silence from a weapon into an opening, and for the first time in years, the quiet in my house did not feel like abandonment. It felt like possibility. The following days felt strangely light, as if the tension we had carried for years had left behind an unexpected space to breathe. I noticed it in small moments, the way the morning sun hit the living room just right, how the coffee tasted less bitter, how I could walk through the kitchen without imagining a silent argument waiting to erupt. I thought often about that afternoon at the table and the strange mixture of relief and responsibility I felt afterward. Relief because truths had been spoken, responsibility because words alone do not heal relationships. Healing required consistency, patience, and, most importantly, action. I began leaving small notes for Renee around the house, reminders that she was capable, that her opinions mattered, that she was still my daughter, but also a woman with her own life. I watched her read them, sometimes smiling softly, sometimes tensing as if she remembered our old pattern of miscommunication. I resisted the urge to explain the notes or their placement, letting them exist on their own, a quiet proof that I was attempting to respect her space while still connecting. Marcus, too, began small gestures, coffee at the table left with a note that said, "Thinking of you," and a book placed on the counter that he thought I might enjoy. These small acts became a rhythm, a new language of presence that did not rely on conflict to establish itself. They reminded me that we could still communicate, still exist in each other's lives, without reliving old wounds each day. One evening, I found myself in the garden, the sun dipping below the horizon and spilling amber light across the flowers Renee had helped me plant. She had suggested marigolds this time, insisting they were brighter than my usual choice of roses, and I had allowed it without comment. Marcus joined me silently, kneeling to pull a stray weed from the soil. The quiet between us was comfortable, no longer heavy or forced. We spoke about ordinary things, the weather, a neighbor's dog, a television show we all liked. Yet beneath the ordinary, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the past had changed us, shaped the contours of our present, and yet did not have to dictate our future. It was in these small moments that I realized the true power of presence, not in dominating the conversation, not in correcting mistakes, but in simply being available, reliable, and patient. My children began to rediscover a version of me that they had long forgotten existed, the mother who listened without judgment, who shared without controlling, who could laugh at herself without feeling weak. In turn, I saw them shed layers of defensiveness, realizing that independence and love were not mutually exclusive. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without occasional setbacks. One afternoon, Renee stormed into the kitchen, slamming the refrigerator door as she unloaded a bag of groceries. Her frustration boiled over in ways that reminded me of the daughter I had once chastised for being too dramatic. Yet instead of responding with correction, I paused, took a breath, and waited. She muttered complaints about her day, about her co-workers, about something minor that had triggered a deep-seated irritation. I listened, asking questions to clarify rather than to fix. By the time she left the room, the tension had dissipated not because I had solved the problem, but because I had allowed her to feel heard without judgment. Marcus watched the exchange with quiet approval, commenting later that listening is often harder than talking, and he was right. It requires patience, humility, and the ability to set aside one's own ego. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I reflected on how much energy I had wasted over the years, believing that silence was safety and control was love. Now I understood that love could be present without dominance, that silence could be neutral, not a weapon, and that independence was not a threat but a gift. As the weeks passed, I noticed subtle changes in our household dynamics. Meals became opportunities for conversation rather than evaluation. Family stories were shared not to correct, but to celebrate memory. Laughter returned in ways that were unfamiliar, yet welcome, filling corners of the house that had long been reserved for caution. Even Marcus, usually the most reserved, began to contribute anecdotes from his own life, creating bridges between past grievances and present connection. One evening, Renee recounted a childhood memory where I had embarrassed her unknowingly, and instead of defensiveness, I laughed along, admitting my oversight and apologizing sincerely. The exchange did not erase the memory, nor did it need to. It transformed it into a shared moment of understanding. In these moments, I realized that reconciliation is not linear. It is composed of small, consistent acts of acknowledgement, empathy, and restraint. It requires letting go of the urge to be right in favor of being present, letting relationships breathe rather than suffocate under accumulated expectation. Then came the day when Renee invited me to accompany her to her new apartment, a place she had recently rented after months of searching. I remember the sunlight catching the walls in a warm glow, how the space felt alive and unclaimed, waiting for her to breathe into it. I felt a strange mixture of pride and humility, seeing her assert independence without fear, making decisions confidently without seeking validation. Marcus tagged along, carrying boxes and helping where needed, but more importantly, silently witnessing our shared growth. As we arranged furniture, unpacked dishes, and laughed over mismatched patterns, I realized that the act of participating in her life on her terms was perhaps the most profound gesture I could offer. It was no longer about guiding or correcting, but about witnessing, supporting, and celebrating. This realization brought with it a deep sense of peace, a quiet acknowledgement that the past, though painful, had brought us to a place of genuine presence. That night, after returning from Renee's apartment, I sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea, reflecting on how much had shifted in such a short period. The house felt calmer, lighter somehow, as if the tension that had accumulated for years was slowly dissipating into the walls themselves. I thought about all the times I had tried to control outcomes, to protect those I loved in ways that ultimately pushed them away. The truth I had been avoiding for decades was that love could exist without domination, without constant monitoring or judgment. Presence, patience, and trust were far more powerful than authority. Marcus came in quietly, setting his mug down beside mine without a word. We sat together in silence, a comfortable presence that had once been impossible. I realized that silence could finally be neutral, a space where reflection and connection coexisted without tension. In that quiet, I felt gratitude for the growth we were all experiencing, individually and together. Our wounds had not disappeared, but they had begun to transform into something that could sustain rather than destroy. The following morning, Renee called early, her voice light but hesitant, a sound that had once been rare over the phone. "Mom," she said, "I was thinking we could start a weekend tradition. Just us, breakfast at your house, talking, no distractions." I agreed immediately, feeling a warmth spread through me that I hadn't anticipated. Breakfast became a ritual of presence rather than obligation. Pancakes, scrambled eggs, and coffee shared over conversation that was neither rushed nor judgmental. We spoke about dreams, challenges, and small victories, each story creating a bridge across years of misunderstanding. Marcus joined when he could, adding his own anecdotes and often sparking laughter that rang through the kitchen. It became evident to me that the act of consistently showing up, of prioritizing time together without expectation or critique, was quietly dismantling the barriers that had kept us apart. It was in these ordinary, unscripted moments that reconciliation deepened. We weren't pretending the past hadn't happened. We were simply choosing to engage differently, moving forward. One afternoon, Renee asked if I would help her with a community project she had started at work, something involving mentoring teenagers in need of guidance. I hesitated initially, unsure if I had the energy or patience for the role, but she insisted gently, reminding me that my experiences could benefit others. I agreed and soon found myself sitting in a small classroom, listening to teenagers share stories of neglect, hardship, and isolation. My heart ached with recognition, recalling moments from my own life when I had felt unheard, unseen, or underestimated. Renee and Marcus watched as I interacted with the students, and I noticed a subtle pride in their expressions that warmed me. By participating, I realized I was contributing to something larger than our family dynamic. I was helping shape a world where presence and compassion mattered more than control. That day, I returned home feeling exhausted, yet invigorated, the satisfaction of meaningful connection replacing old anxieties about failure or judgment. Later, Marcus and I worked together in the garden, clearing weeds and planting new blooms. The physical labor was grounding, but our conversation deepened as we shared reflections about past mistakes. Marcus admitted his own moments of avoidance, his tendency to step back when conflict arose. I acknowledged my attempts to overcorrect, to control, and we laughed quietly at the irony of our parallel behaviors. There was a tenderness in that exchange that had been absent in all our previous conversations. We weren't rewriting history, nor were we excusing missteps. We were recognizing patterns and making a conscious choice to move forward differently. The garden itself became symbolic, a tangible space where effort, patience, and care produced visible results, mirroring the slow, deliberate work required to mend human relationships. Each seed we planted, each blossom we nurtured, felt like a small testament to growth, resilience, and the possibility of renewal. Evenings became moments of reflection rather than routine chores. I began journaling again, not to plan revenge or record grievances, but to chart gratitude and insight. My entries shifted from criticism to acknowledgement, noticing the smallest acts of kindness, documenting moments of genuine laughter, recognizing growth in myself and my children. This exercise, humble as it was, fostered awareness and perspective. I realized that transformation is rarely dramatic. It is incremental, often imperceptible day to day, but cumulative in its effect. The act of observing, acknowledging, and valuing these shifts reinforced the changes I hoped to maintain. Renee began journaling alongside me, sharing her reflections voluntarily, while Marcus sometimes contributed his own notes. The ritual of writing created a shared language, a bridge connecting hearts without requiring confrontation or persuasion. Then came a weekend when Marcus suggested a family outing, something we hadn't done in decades. He proposed a trip to a local park, just the three of us, with no agenda other than to enjoy time together. I initially hesitated, wary of expectations, but agreed, sensing the importance of action reinforcing words. That morning, we packed sandwiches, water, and a blanket, and drove together in comfortable silence punctuated by soft music. At the park, we walked slowly along shaded paths, exchanging stories about childhood adventures, favorite teachers, and small victories in life. There were moments of laughter, moments of reflective silence, and even a few tears, not of sorrow but of recognition of our resilience, our mistakes, and the bonds that had endured despite distance and misunderstanding. Marcus pointed out a family of ducks near the pond, and we watched them glide across the water, their effortless coordination reminding me of the harmony we were cultivating. By the time we left, I realized that the simple act of shared experience, without expectation or agenda, was healing in ways that conversation alone could not achieve. After that park visit, a subtle shift settled into our daily lives. Even the quiet mornings seemed softer, with light filtering through the curtains differently, as if the house itself acknowledged our progress. Renee began to leave little notes on the kitchen counter, reminders to drink water, funny anecdotes from work, sometimes even a small sketch of a flower she had noticed outside. Marcus joined in with casual comments, jokes that felt genuine rather than performative. I noticed how these small acts, almost mundane, carried weight, the weight of acknowledgement, attention, and presence. They were gestures of reconciliation, proof that we were learning to coexist without letting the past dominate our interactions. The house, which had once felt like a place of tension and distance, now seemed to breathe along with us, filled with small signals of care that accumulated into a palpable sense of belonging. It was remarkable how small gestures consistently applied could rebuild trust more effectively than grand declarations ever could. One afternoon, I was sorting through old photo albums, images of birthdays, vacations, and school events that had once been a source of nostalgic joy but had later become reminders of missed opportunities and misunderstandings. Renee approached me quietly, leaning against the doorway, and asked if she could look through them too. We sat side by side on the couch, flipping pages slowly, discussing memories we had never shared aloud. Marcus joined us, adding commentary on moments he remembered differently. Each photograph became a starting point for conversation, a chance to reinterpret the past without blame. What I realized in that moment was that reconciliation requires more than apologies. It requires shared understanding, acknowledgement of each perspective, and the willingness to create new narratives together. By revisiting old memories with empathy rather than judgment, we were weaving threads of connection that had frayed over time. Laughter returned naturally, unforced, mingling with quiet sighs of recognition as we acknowledged both mistakes and growth. The garden became another focal point for our renewed connection. Renee suggested we plant a small vegetable patch alongside the flowers, a practical yet intimate project. Marcus and I dug the soil, measured rows, and planted seeds together while Renee arranged decorative stones around the edges. The act of tending to living things became a metaphor for our own relationships. Consistent care, patience, and attention were necessary to ensure growth. Each day we checked the soil, watered the plants, and celebrated small sprouts as victories. The vegetable patch, initially a simple project, grew into a shared responsibility and a symbol of our commitment to nurture rather than neglect. Watching the plants thrive reminded me that reconciliation, like gardening, requires patience, effort, and the willingness to embrace imperfections. It was a lesson in persistence and quiet pride. One evening, Renee suggested we cook together, a practice we hadn't attempted in decades. She pulled out recipes she had discovered online, and we laughed over her insistence on following every measurement precisely, a trait she had inherited from me despite our years of friction. Marcus took charge of washing and chopping vegetables, teasing us about our differing styles. Cooking together without tension or expectation became an exercise in collaboration and patience. We experimented with flavors, adjusted seasonings, and learned to appreciate each other's contributions without judgment. That night, the meal was more than nourishment. It was an act of unity, a tangible demonstration that our family could coexist harmoniously despite the scars of the past. We sat around the table afterward, savoring the food and the shared effort that had produced it. It was a quiet celebration, without fanfare, but deeply meaningful in its authenticity. The weekend following our cooking session, Marcus suggested a small family project, compiling a scrapbook of our collective memories. We gathered photos, ticket stubs, notes, and small keepsakes that had accumulated over the years. Each item sparked conversation, each story a bridge from past to present. Renee and I debated the best way to arrange photographs, sometimes laughing over our differing opinions, sometimes pausing to reflect. Marcus contributed by writing captions and organizing the pages, a role he embraced quietly but effectively. The scrapbook became more than a collection of memories. It was a symbol of our intention to preserve the past while embracing a new way of relating. By documenting our shared history, we acknowledged our mistakes, celebrated our growth, and cemented the lessons we had learned in ways that were visible and lasting. One particularly quiet afternoon, I found myself reflecting on the transformation that had taken place. The past, once heavy and oppressive, now felt more like context than constraint. I thought about the arguments that had defined our family for years, the moments of distance, the misunderstandings that seemed insurmountable at the time. And yet, here we were, present, attentive, and patient with each other. I realized that reconciliation is not about erasing history, but about reconfiguring its impact. It is about allowing space for empathy, for growth, for love that is not contingent on perfection. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not only for the changes in my children, but also for my own willingness to let go of control and embrace presence. The evenings that followed carried a sense of ritual. Renee and Marcus would often join me for tea in the living room, sometimes reading, sometimes sharing stories, sometimes simply sitting in silence. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was a companionable space, a time to reflect and rejuvenate. Occasionally, Renee would bring up her fears, her anxieties about the future, and we would discuss them openly, without judgment. Marcus would offer practical advice, gently guiding when necessary but never imposing. In these moments, I understood that the pattern of our family had shifted from conflict and control to communication and respect. We were learning to coexist in a way that honored individual autonomy while nurturing connection, and the transformation felt both fragile and profound. That Saturday, Renee suggested we take a short trip to the countryside, a place she remembered from childhood visits with her friends. I hesitated, unsure if a long drive would disrupt the calm we had finally established, but something in her voice, gentle yet insistent, convinced me to go. Marcus volunteered to drive, which gave me a sense of relief, knowing he could manage the roads without tension or distraction. As we drove, the landscape shifted from familiar streets to rolling hills and open fields, and with each mile, a sense of liberation settled over me. The air smelled fresher, the sunlight seemed warmer, and I realized how rarely I allowed myself to fully appreciate the beauty around me. The drive became a metaphor for the journey we were taking as a family, moving from tension and resentment into spaces that felt open and expansive. It was remarkable how simple movement through a new environment could mirror internal transformation. Upon arrival, we found a small picnic area near a riverbank, shaded by tall oak trees whose branches swayed gently in the wind. We unpacked sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade, settling onto a large blanket. Renee pointed out birds and insects with a childlike enthusiasm that was infectious, and Marcus began skipping stones across the water, laughter echoing with ease. For the first time in years, I felt like an observer and a participant simultaneously, free from the weight of past grievances, yet fully engaged with the present. The river itself seemed to mirror our progress, flowing steadily, overcoming obstacles along the way, and reflecting light in unexpected ways. Sitting there, watching my children interact with the world and with each other, I understood that the most profound reconciliation often occurs quietly, in moments of simple presence rather than dramatic gestures. We spent hours walking along trails, sharing memories of our own childhood adventures in similar settings. Renee recalled a summer camp trip that had left her terrified of heights, while Marcus teased her about exaggerated fears. I laughed, remembering my own misadventures and the ways I had tried to protect them, sometimes overzealously, sometimes in error. These stories, once sources of conflict or embarrassment, now became points of connection and humor. I realized that our shared history, even with its mistakes, was a resource for building intimacy rather than a burden to be avoided. By reframing these experiences as learning opportunities and moments of resilience, we were able to deepen our relationships organically. Every laugh, every memory, every small act of attention reinforced the bond we had been reconstructing for months. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, we stopped at a small wooden bridge spanning a quiet creek. Marcus leaned against the railing, staring thoughtfully into the water, while Renee skipped pebbles to watch the ripples expand outward. I stood beside them, feeling a sense of completeness I hadn't anticipated. It occurred to me that healing is rarely linear. It is cyclical, with moments of insight, connection, and joy interspersed with reflection and introspection. What mattered most was consistency, the ongoing choice to engage with empathy and patience rather than retreating into past grievances. In that moment, I felt gratitude for our shared progress and for the patience required to reach this point. The bridge became symbolic, a literal and figurative crossing from past to present, a path toward ongoing growth and connection. On the drive back home, we played music from our shared youth, songs that had once been the soundtrack of childhood arguments and sibling rivalry. Instead of stirring tension, the melodies elicited laughter and nostalgic conversation. Renee sang along softly, her voice tentative but sincere, while Marcus hummed along, tapping the steering wheel in rhythm. I joined in, surprised at how naturally the old tunes evoked joy rather than conflict. Music, I realized, had been an overlooked connector in our family dynamic. It bypassed argument, bypassed ego, and spoke directly to shared memory and emotion. By embracing it again, we reclaimed a dimension of our connection that had been dormant for too long, proving that reconciliation often arrives in the form of rediscovered common ground. Once home, we prepared a simple dinner together, continuing the ritual we had begun weeks earlier. Renee chopped vegetables while Marcus stirred the pot, and I organized the table. Conversation flowed easily, unburdened by guilt or old resentments. Marcus shared a story about a challenge at work, seeking advice rather than validation, and Renee offered a supportive perspective rather than criticism. I listened quietly, offering encouragement without overstepping, a delicate balance I had only recently mastered. The evening ended with dessert and a quiet moment on the porch where we watched the first stars appear. The night felt serene, the tension of years replaced with calm attentiveness and shared appreciation. It was a tangible reminder that transformation takes time, but each intentional action compounds toward a lasting impact. The next week, Renee asked if we could start a small book club, just the three of us, reading novels and discussing themes that resonated with our lives. I agreed, intrigued by the idea of exploring narratives that mirrored our own experiences. Marcus was skeptical at first, but curiosity won, and soon we were sharing insights, drawing parallels between fiction and our personal growth. The discussions were thoughtful and occasionally challenging, but always framed in respect and curiosity. We began to notice patterns in our communication, recognizing assumptions and misinterpretations that had previously caused conflict. By examining external narratives together, we developed a shared vocabulary for addressing our own lives, fostering understanding without confrontation. The book club became another layer of connection, a structured yet flexible space for dialogue, reflection, and empathy. Evenings continued to grow more predictable in the best sense. Renee, Marcus, and I would often sit together after dinner, sometimes playing board games, sometimes listening to music, sometimes simply watching the sunset. These moments were not remarkable in isolation, but cumulatively they created a rhythm that reinforced trust and presence. Small acts of attentiveness, asking how each other's day went, leaving a glass of water by the bedside, remembering a minor preference, accumulated into a tangible sense of safety and belonging. It was remarkable how much power there is in consistency, in the act of repeatedly showing up in ways that matter. Trust, I realized, is less about dramatic demonstrations than about the sum of countless small gestures, each one a vote for connection rather than distance. One chilly morning, I awoke to the faint sound of birdsong outside the window, a reminder that even after storms, life continues with quiet persistence. Renee was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she brewed coffee, while Marcus sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. I stretched and watched them, a warmth spreading through my chest. It struck me how far we had come, from the silence and tension that once filled our home to a space alive with connection and understanding. No grand gestures, no explosive confrontations, just the slow accumulation of care and attentiveness. I realized that peace is not an event but a habit, a choice made over and over until it becomes a part of who we are. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee, a simple but powerful comfort. Renee approached me with a small notebook in hand. "I thought we could start a gratitude journal," she said, her eyes bright. I smiled, recalling how hesitant I had been when she suggested it weeks ago, worried it would feel forced or artificial. But now I understood the subtle power of intentional reflection. We sat together at the table, each taking turns writing a sentence about something we appreciated that day. Marcus added a few lines as well, tentative at first, then gradually more open, describing moments he had enjoyed without even realizing their significance. The act of writing together created a rhythm, a gentle ritual that anchored us in awareness of the small joys that had been overshadowed by past resentment. I felt my heart lighten with every line, a tangible acknowledgement that our lives were being reclaimed, piece by piece. Later that afternoon, we decided to visit the local community garden, a place I had admired from afar for years. The garden was modest but thriving, with rows of vegetables and flowers tended by volunteers who greeted us warmly. Renee immediately gravitated toward the marigolds, while Marcus wandered through the vegetable beds, inspecting the tomatoes and herbs with curious eyes. I followed slowly, taking in the sunlight and the hum of bees, feeling an ease I hadn't experienced in a long time. There is a rhythm to gardens that mirrors life itself, planting, nurturing, waiting, and eventually harvesting. Watching my children engage with this space, I realized how much growth we had nurtured in each other. Connection, patience, and love, like seeds, flourish when given time and care. By late afternoon, we returned home with baskets of fresh produce, and I suggested we make dinner together using what we had picked. The kitchen became alive with activity, chopping, stirring, and tasting as we experimented with new recipes. Renee laughed at her attempts to julienne carrots, while Marcus teased her with exaggerated mockery that made everyone grin. I realized how easy it had become to enjoy each other's company without the shadow of old conflicts. We had learned the delicate balance of presence and space, of speaking and listening. In the past, disagreements would have escalated quickly, leaving lingering tension. Now, even minor mistakes were met with humor and grace, a reflection of the deeper bond we had rebuilt over months of patient effort. After dinner, we carried our dishes to the porch and sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The evening air carried a soft chill, but the warmth of our presence made the cold irrelevant. Renee sipped her tea and glanced at me with a shy smile. "I didn't think it could ever feel like this," she whispered. Marcus nodded, leaning back in his chair, eyes reflective. I didn't respond immediately, instead taking a slow breath and allowing the moment to settle around us. This was the culmination of all the small steps we had taken: dinners shared, conversations held, rituals created, and moments of reflection embraced. It was fragile and yet resilient, a balance that required constant attention, but one worth maintaining. That night I found myself alone for a while, sitting in my favorite chair with a blanket draped over my knees. I reflected on the journey, the twists and turns that had once seemed insurmountable. The silence in the house was no longer empty but full of potential, a space where future stories could unfold without fear or resentment. I thought of past conflicts, of moments when I had felt powerless, invisible, and erased, and I recognized the strength it had taken to reclaim my life. Healing, I realized, is both an inward and outward journey, reclaiming one's sense of self while gently inviting others to meet you in a new space of understanding. There was no need for dramatic declarations, only consistent presence and intentional choices. Over the following weeks, our routines solidified. We continued the gratitude journals, shared meals, gardened together, and maintained small rituals that reinforced connection. Renee began painting again, her canvases reflecting color and emotion, while Marcus explored photography, capturing the world with a fresh perspective. I marveled at their creativity and growth, understanding that part of reconciliation is witnessing each other flourish. There were still challenges, moments of tension or disagreement, but the foundation we had built allowed us to navigate these moments with patience and empathy. Each day reinforced that our relationships were no longer defined by past mistakes, but by our commitment to presence, understanding, and love. One morning, I received a letter in the mail from a local elder advocacy group, inviting me to speak at a workshop about family reconciliation and elder rights. Initially, I hesitated, unsure if sharing our story would feel too personal or exposing. But then I thought of the countless people who might benefit from hearing that change, forgiveness, and connection are possible. I realized that our journey had value beyond ourselves, and that the lessons we had learned could help others navigate their own family struggles. I accepted the invitation, knowing that telling our story could create ripples of hope and encouragement, and that our experiences, though painful, had the power to teach and inspire. On the day of the workshop, Renee and Marcus accompanied me, providing moral support and a sense of shared purpose. As I spoke to the group, I recounted our journey with honesty, acknowledging past mistakes, misunderstandings, and the challenges of rebuilding trust. I emphasized the importance of small, consistent actions, open communication, and patience, and the room responded with nods, smiles, and in some cases, tears. I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, understanding that our story, once confined to our home, now had the potential to touch lives and foster healing in ways we could not have anticipated. My children listened quietly, occasionally exchanging glances, and I recognized the pride they felt in our collective growth. Returning home that evening, the three of us sat on the porch, watching the sunset and reflecting on the journey we had undertaken together. Renee spoke softly about the importance of hope, Marcus reflected on the value of patience, and I shared my thoughts on resilience. The conversation was gentle, reflective, and full of appreciation for one another. I realized that the path to reconciliation is rarely linear. It is filled with both triumphs and setbacks, yet the moments of understanding and connection define its trajectory. As night fell, I felt a sense of peace that had been elusive for years, a quiet assurance that despite past pain, we had created a family dynamic rooted in trust, empathy, and enduring love.